I'm a ranger at Kakadu National Park in Australia's Northern Territory. And last month, an American couple arrived at the visitor center, demanding to know why we'd removed all the kangaroos from the brochure pictures. I explained that Kakadu is famous for crocodiles. Rock art and wetlands kangaroos aren't really the main attraction here. The husband pulled out his phone, showing me a Google image search of Australia animals and said, "See? Kangaroos." We paid for the Australia Experience package. I gently mentioned that Australia is roughly the size of the continental United States, and different regions have different wildlife. He looked at his wife and said, "Honey, I think they're hiding them for the premium tour." Kangaroos were union workers, and if that's why they weren't performing during standard, visiting ours. And this is exactly the kind of unfiltered, boots-on-the-ground Australian absurdity I track full-time so you don't have to. If you appreciate getting the reality instead of the brochure fantasy, you'll want to lock in now. This is the level I bring every week. His wife nodded seriously and asked what time the kangaroo shift change happened. I work at a bottle shop in Adelaide, and an American tourist tried to return a six-pack of beer because the kangaroo on the label looked photoshopped. She'd been in Australia for 4 days and hadn't seen a single kangaroo in the city, so she'd concluded that our entire national identity was false advertising. Threatened to report us to the Better Business Bureau, the American one. And if you're noticing the pattern here, the way these stories slowly reveal the gap between expectation and reality, this is exactly why people who think a little deeper stick around. I don't just tell stories, I decode the psychology underneath them. If that's your speed, if you know where you belong, my neighbor in Melbourne got a complaint letter slipped under her door from the American Airbnb guest staying upstairs. He was demanding a partial refund because the apartment was advertised as authentic Australian living, but he'd seen 0 kangaroos from his window in 3 days. He'd apparently been keeping a log. I'm a receptionist at a medical clinic in Perth, and an American patient came in insisting he needed a kangaroo attack protocol vaccination. He'd been in Western Australia for 2 weeks, seen 0 kangaroos, and had developed an elaborate theory that they were nocturnal predators that specifically targeted tourists. He'd read on a Facebook group that Australians don't talk about kangaroo attacks because of tourism concerns. When I explained that kangaroos generally avoid humans and the dangerous wildlife here is more the snakes and spiders, he said, "That's exactly what someone covering up kangaroo attacks would say." He'd brought a 3-page document of evidence, including a screenshot of a kangaroo boxing video with his own annotations about attack patterns. Demanded we put him on a preventative for treatment. I told him we don't have a kangaroo attack vaccine. He asked to speak to someone from the Australian CDC and seemed genuinely confused when explained, "We have different health agencies." He left saying he'd document everything and set up a motion-activated camera outside his hotel pointing at the nearest park. I work at the Sydney Opera House gift shop, and an American tourist tried to return a stuffed kangaroo toy because it was false merchandise. She'd been on a 3-day Sydney tour harbor cruise, Bondi Beach, Blue Mountains, and hadn't encountered a single live kangaroo. She said the toy represented a breach of consumer trust, and that she was considering filing a complaint with the Australian Tourism Board for species misrepresentation. I mentioned that kangaroos are more common in rural areas and national parks. She responded, "So you're saying Sydney isn't the real Australia?" Then she asked if we had truth in advertising laws here and whether the opera house itself was actually a functional opera house or just another tourist trap. She'd convinced herself that Australia was an elaborate theme park where everything iconic was either exaggerated or completely fabricated. I'm a barista in Brisbane, and an American customer asked me why Australians had collectively decided to gaslight tourists about kangaroo populations. He'd been traveling up the east coast for 10 days and had only seen kangaroos from the car on a highway at dusk. He'd expected them to be like squirrels in urban areas. When I explained that wildlife doesn't just roam around cities, he said, But every single Australian thing has a kangaroo on a tour airline. Your coins, your sports teams. That would be like America putting bald eagles on everything. But keeping them all in secret government facilities. He'd calculated that based on the kangaroo-to-branding ratio every Australian should see. Approximately 47 kangaroos per day. He showed me a spreadsheet. Then he asked if there was a kangaroo viewing permit he needed to purchase, and if that's why locals could see them, but tourists couldn't. He suggested that government was running a Paddy wildlife scheme and wanted to know where to buy the premium access pass. I'm a tour guide in Tasmania, and an American couple on a wildlife tour got genuinely upset that our Tasmanian devil and wildlife experience didn't include kangaroos. I explained that while there are some wallabies in Tasmania, we focus on species unique to the island. The husband interrupted. So Tasmania isn't part of Australia? I confirmed it absolutely is. He said, then where are the kangaroos? This is false advertising. You can't just remove the national animal from an entire state. His wife pulled up the Australian coat of arms on her phone showing the kangaroo and emu and said, this is government imagery. You're legally required to have these animals available for viewing. I tried to explain that the coat of arms is symbolic. He responded, in America, our national bird is the bald eagle, and you can see them. You can't just put an animal on your government seal and then not have it everywhere. Demanded we drive them to wherever you're hiding. Them and suggested we were keeping them in a facility-like area. 51 but for kangaroos. I work at a hotel in Darwin, and an American guest filed a formal complaint because his room didn't have a kangaroo viewing guarantee it's specifically chosen. Accommodation advertised as authentic top-end experience and felt betrayed by the lack of kangaroos visible from his balcony. When I mentioned that Darwin's tropical climate means different wildlife crocodiles, wallabies exotic birds, he accused us of regional favoritism and said he'd be writing to his congressman about discriminatory wildlife distribution practices in Australian territories. Somehow convinced himself that each Australian state was required to maintain equal kangaroo populations and that the Northern Territory was shirking its responsibility. He wanted to know who enforced Australia's animal equality laws and whether he could file a formal complaint before checking out. He left a one-star review saying the hotel had committed to Australian identity, but failed to deliver on marsupial promises. I'm a zookeeper at Taronga Zoo in Sydney, and an American family came to the kangaroo enclosure and seemed genuinely shocked to see them. The father said, wait, so they do exist? Apparently they'd been in Sydney for a week. Developed a theory that kangaroos were culturally exaggerated like drop bears. Assumed the whole thing was an inside joke Australians played on tourists. When they saw real kangaroos, the mother got emotional and said, I told everyone back home they weren't real. I have a whole Facebook post. The father started taking excessive photos as proof and asked if we'd provide a signed certificate from the zoo confirming kangaroos' existence that he could show his friends. Then the teenage daughter asked, if kangaroos are real, does that mean drop bears might be real too? And they spent 15 minutes seriously discussing whether we were covering up dangerous wildlife. The father asked if there was a comprehensive real versus faked Australian animals list published by the government. Before leaving, he approached me and whispered, be honest, what percentage of Australian wildlife is actually real? Like he was asking me to reveal a massive conspiracy. I manage a rural property about 2 hours west of Sydney. And last spring, an American couple knocked on my door asking if they could rent kangaroo access to my land. They'd been driving through the countryside, finally saw kangaroos grazing on my property at sunset, and assumed I was running some kind of exclusive wildlife viewing operation. I explained these were just wild kangaroos that happened to be on my land. They come and go freely. The husband said, so you're telling me you have kangaroos just ... showing up for free? When I confirmed that's how wild animals work, his wife said, this seems like a liability issue. Do you have insurance for this? I mentioned that kangaroos are native wildlife, and it's completely normal. He responded, in America, If you had buffalo just wandering onto your property, that would be a federal situation.
Then
He asked if I'd signed a waiver with the Kangaroos and whether they were bonded and insured. His wife was taking notes and muttering about unregulated wildlife exposure and premises liability. They offered me $200 to guarantee the Kangaroos would still be there in an hour when they came back with better cameras. I tried explaining I have zero control over wild animals. The husband said, "But they're on your land. Doesn't that make them your responsibility?" He'd somehow concluded that Australian property law included wildlife management obligations and that I was legally required to maintain a minimum kangaroo presence. When I laughed and said I couldn't make any guarantees about wildlife, he looked genuinely concerned and said, "How do you run a business like this?" I told him I run a sheep farm, not a kangaroo attraction. He squinted at me and said, "Is that what you call it for tax purposes?" Fully convinced I was operating an underground kangaroo tourism operation and using sheep farming as a front. His wife asked if she needed to sign an NDA. They left. Came back 90 minutes later with professional camera equipment, and the Kangaroos had moved on. The husband stood in my driveway and said, "I knew it was too good to be true," like he'd just uncovered a sophisticated scam, working in Australian tourism. You realize Americans expect our wildlife to have the consistency of Disney World character? Appearances scheduled, guaranteed, and available for photos. The idea that you might visit Australia and not see a kangaroo in urban areas genuinely breaks their understanding of how countries work. But I'll never forget the American who asked me, with complete sincerity, whether Australians had domesticated kangaroos but keep it secret to maintain the wild image for tourism purposes. He'd created an entire conspiracy theory involving government wildlife actors, trained kangaroos, and coordinated national gaslighting. Sometimes I wonder what they tell people back home. Australia. Lovely place. Kangaroos are a myth, though. Don't believe the hype.